At a corporate party, my wife's boss humiliated me. He had no idea what was coming. The glitz of the city skyline twinkled against the night, casting a glittering reflection on Julian's apprehensive heart. Encased in a tailored suit that felt a size too large, he and his wife Anaisa emerged from the elevator onto the grand floor of the corporate gala. It was a spectacle. Vibrant lights mingled with laughter, the chime of glasses clinking, and a band softly serenading the crowd. Yet, amid the glamour, Julian felt as though he wore an invisible cloak of tension. Anaisa had been distant for weeks, her laughter often directed toward her colleagues more than toward him. He brushed off his doubts, convincing himself that tonight was about celebration, and that the office's pressures had simply pushed her to retreat inward. Worry creased his brow as he glanced at her, the way her cobalt dress hugged her figure, making his heart swell and sink simultaneously. But there he stood beside her, an unassuming man at the precipice of impending chaos, unaware that the man he least suspected, Rich von Hauer, Anisa's CEO, was poised to wreak havoc on their lives. As the evening unfolded and the glint of wine glasses sparkled in his vision, Julian caught glimmers of intimacy shared between Rich and Anaisa, fueling his unease. With every shared glance and secret smile, his instincts screamed betrayal. While conversation flowed around him, Julian felt untethered, a voyeur to the life and the love that had once been so deeply his. As the night unfurled, it became increasingly difficult for him to shake the feeling of isolation. The thrumming of the band beneath the grand chandelier seemed to stifle his thoughts. Julian forced himself to navigate the room, offering polite smiles when approached by familiar faces, an old college friend, a senior partner from the firm, their words lost in a muffled cacophony. The scent of expensive colognes and musky perfumes mingled, an intoxicating fog that both comforted and suffocated. "What do you think, Julian?" A voice, Brian, a fellow employee, brought his thoughts racing back. His smile was broad, dismissing the distress he had tried to ignore. "Isn't it wonderful?" "Yeah, wonderful," Julian replied, the words slipping from his lips with a hollow resonance. His eyes flickered past Brian to Anaisa, now engaged in spirited conversation with Rich. She leaned into him, her laughter a melody that seemed to beckon and taunt him all at once. The vision of them standing close, sharing inside jokes wrought with familiarity, and he dared to think, intimacy gave rise to unease swelling in his chest. With a polite nod, Julian excused himself. While Brian continued to regale tales of their latest project, Julian felt as if he were losing a part of himself, piecing together fragments of emotions he didn't know how to process. He pressed against the edges of the crowd as the band dulled out a slow, romantic tune, lifting the mood while further entrenching Julian in solitude. The moments dragged into what felt like a labyrinth of faces and conversations, but each connection merely felt like a grainy painting of a life he was losing touch with. As if by a cruel twist of fate, he could almost feel Rich's energy directed at Anaisa, completely disconcerting him. He watched as Rich gestured toward her, a hand lingering far too long on her elbow, a gesture imbued with a slight underlying proprietorship that triggered fires of resentment within him. "Excuse me," Julian muttered as he found an alcove, seeking comfort in the coolness of the marble wall. He leaned against it, closing his eyes for a moment, an attempt to collect his racing thoughts. If only he could bridge the gap, if only he could summon the right words to bring Anaisa back into focus where she belonged. Right by his side, surrounded by love instead of layers of festivity and deception. His eyes scanned the gala again, this time focusing keenly on Anaisa. She was animated, tossing her head back in exuberance, her laughter a soft peal that would usually warm his heart but now left it feeling frigid in its absence. But deeper still, the flip of emotions left him teetering on a precipice. The animated conversations around him melded with his racing heartbeats, filling the hall with anticipation that strangled him. Suddenly, Julian caught the duo's eyes linking from across the room, a fleeting moment that swelled into a torrent of confusion and dread. Anaisa turned, glancing his way with a smile, so radiant it felt both inviting and dismissive. Did she sense his waning resolve? Was there any recognition of his internal battle beneath her warmth? For the briefest moment, he found a sliver of hope, a glimmer that she would break the spell of this intoxicating chaos and return to him. His heart warped beneath the sheer vulnerability of the moment, a painful yet alluring reminder of everything they had built together. But before he could acknowledge the shift, Rich leaned in close again, whispering something that made Anaisa blush deeply, a bold cabal of amusement spinning around her. Something inexplicable snapped inside him, a gate giving way to feelings uninvited and raw. He felt anger crackling in the depths of his being, simmering beneath the surface as Rich continued to weave a grotesque performance of charm. It was like walking through a museum of shadowed memories. Every laugh, every shared smile between them became a painting on the wall, and Julian felt like a spectator lost in a sea of vibrant colors yet unable to draw near. Now, more than before, it crystallized in him the unmistakable feeling of inadequacy. How did he allow himself to slip into the role of the invisible husband when the truth and love stood trembling beneath his very fingertips? Suddenly craving clarity, he pushed through the throngs of people, eyes trained firmly on Anaïsa and Rich. Each step felt like a snug fit, hands around his heart too tight as he grappled with each breath, quelling his rising emotions. But what would he say? What could he possibly articulate that wouldn't slip away like sand before the tides? Julian, someone called, forcing him to halt. It was another colleague, but the urgency propelled him forward, toward the only warmth that had ever lured him, toward Anaïsa, his wife, standing embroiled in laughter but terribly distant. What did her laughter really mean? What was this absurd gala meant to convey? Did she even realize the heartache surging beneath all their polished facades? Each heartbeat thundered in his ears, a drum roll for the chaos that awaited, the collision of vulnerability and desire now setting the stage for the turmoil he could feel lurking just behind the velvet curtains of their once shared life. As the gala continued, Julian found himself cornered, both figuratively and emotionally. The room swelled with laughter and celebration, but the laughter felt muffled to him, drowning beneath the cacophony of his spiraling thoughts. Anaïsa was elusive, charming the attendees with her vibrant personality, sharing jokes with Rich that Julian didn't comprehend. It seemed as if she was illuminating the space while he withered in the shadows, anchored by insecurities that clawed at the edges of his mind. The atmosphere shimmered with a deceptive joy, and Julian's heart echoed with a resounding silence. How could she be so carefree when he felt so heavy? He watched her glowing, her eyes sparkling with a mischief he had once cherished but now felt foreign. He'd loved that laughter, but tonight, it seemed deliberately aimed to keep him at arm's length, distant from the warmth he so desperately craved. She was his partner, and yet he felt as though he were an audience member to her performance, the applause of their shared life merely a memory slipping through his fingers. Determined to reconnect, Julian approached her, hand outstretched, a glass of champagne trembling within it. The golden bubbles reflected his hope, and he willed for that moment of connection to blossom, one tender smile, a moment spent merely basking in each other's presence. Anaïsa, he ventured, voice nearly lost amid the chatter and music. She turned, momentarily surprised by his presence, her eyes flicking toward him before darting back to Rich. "Here, I thought you were mingling," she said, her voice light but edged with distraction. He handed her the glass, and she accepted it, but her fingers brushed his for barely a heartbeat. As she raised the glass to her lips, taking a slow sip, Julian felt a throb of disappointment blossom in his chest. Was that it? Was that the extent of their connection tonight, a fleeting touch, a delicate glass filled with bubbling liquid? Every ounce of courage within him shriveled when he caught Rich leaning in closer, whispering something into her ear that made her giggle, an adorable sound that felt like ice-cold water splash across his heart. Did he want to hear it? He couldn't bear to smile back, to pretend there wasn't a raw edge to the laughter that enveloped them now. It was as though he were watching a stage play unfolding. He was cast unwittingly as the jester in a cruel narrative woven from moments he had once found delightful. Nausea surged within him. Why was he still standing here, trapped in this surreal tableau of half-remembered affection? Rich scripted every gesture, every flirt, while he stood paralyzed by confusion, his heart threading itself into bewildering knots. Was this their life now? A stage show where he was the invisible man, the devoted husband who vanished against the backdrop of Anaïsa's glamour? The gala, once a backdrop for celebration, morphed into a vision of dread, another act in this raging play of betrayal that threatened to collapse around him. His heart began to race, a panicked thrum that pushed against the confines of his chest. Standing amid the crowd, he felt the walls of tension stitching tighter, an encompassing fabric of uncertainty that suffocated him. He didn't understand. He didn't know what brought them to this point. With each moment that passed, Julian's stomach twisted tighter, caught between stifled breaths and pangs of betrayal. He needed answers, yet the fear of confrontation gripped him like a vice. Would he unravel all that they had, his world, the fragile trust that still managed to exist beneath that polished surface? Or did he want to confront Anaïsa, her laughter, her joy directed at someone else? All he had left were unanswered questions like ghosts lingering in the corners of his mind. "Hey, Julian," called Brian, a fellow employee, yet the joyful exuberance in his voice felt stark and out of place. The shout snapped Julian from his daze, the persistent buzz of social clutter swallowing him whole before he could collect his thoughts. Yeah, he managed, forcing a smile, even as his heart thudded dully against the sight unfolding before him. Isn't it great? The vibe in here tonight, Brian exclaimed, blissfully unaware of the turmoil churning in Julian's heart. Wonderful, Julian echoed, the words slipping from his lips devoid of sincerity. His eyes turned quickly back to Anaïsa, only to be pierced by the sight of her unwavering attention on Rich, the CO's purring confidence bending around her like iron shackles, his charm entwining them both in a cocoon that left Julian feeling invisible. Monumental silence enveloped Julian as he observed them. It was as if the music had quietly paused, leaving echoes of laughter ringing hollow. The crowd danced, twirled, and swayed to vibrant rhythms while he stood rigid. Despite their laughter suffusing the air, Julian felt like a mere relic under the grandeur, as though time had paused and the gala had forgotten him entirely. It was devastatingly cruel to consider that perhaps, in this unyielding spotlight cast by Rich, he had already lost Anaïsa, not to another man, but to the armor of disconnection that had not been present between them for far too long. The band is incredible, right? Brian rattled on, seeming oblivious to Julian's emotional detachment. It was difficult to engage fully. And therein lay the rub. He desired to be cordial, to connect, yet every bit of his mind anchored him to the present, to Anaïsa, to the growing realization that their relationship was teetering on the precipice of calamity. Oh yeah, they really are, Julian said absent-mindedly, his eyes once more finding Anaïsa. A slow, wretched burn spread through his veins as he watched Rich gesture toward her, that hand lingering far too long against her skin. The sight of it nestled deep in his gut. The irony was crippling. How could he be witnessing something so intimate unfold at a company gala, suffocated by the silence of his own hesitations? He felt invisible, unmoored yet deeply anchored to the reality of his situation, a loneliness that thrummed beneath the glittering surface of flutes and laughter. He didn't belong here. He needed to escape. He needed air, space away from the laughter and joy that was no longer shared between him and Anaïsa. Turning abruptly, he forced his way into an alcove, pressing against the cool marble wall. He closed his eyes, trying to grasp fleeting emotions, but they slipped through like grains of sand. The sound of the gala faded into a distant hum too far to reach, giving room for his chaotic thoughts. Can love endure this? Can I survive the truth? Ultimately, it came down to the fabric of their connection. He thought of their quiet nights spent wrapped in shared blankets, of shared dreams too intricately woven to be unraveled entirely. They had built a life together. Even now, it felt insidiously fragile. And yet, that specter of betrayal tightened its vice around his heart, squeezing out remnants of the passion they used to share. The pointed glances exchanged between Rich and Anaïsa gnawed at him, evoking a sense of helplessness he'd never known. Was he on the precipice, destined to play the passive actor in a grim story that didn't belong to him? He could feel his emotions rising to the surface, claws of clarity and determination thrumming beneath. As he peered through the thinning crowd, he caught another fleeting glimpse of Anaïsa, her radiant laughter swallowing him whole as she leaned against Rich. The room transformed into a stage rife with hidden confrontations. The stakes were rising, and something deep inside him began to crack, the glaring need to confront the truth, to confront her. The very essence of their love hung in the balance. He pushed himself off the wall, heart racing, swallowing hard against the surge of resolve. This was not over yet. His voice would rise from the depths of turmoil, propelling him forward toward the very woman who had smiled so brightly before him, now tangled in confusion and joy he felt entirely barred from. He needed answers. He owed it to himself, to Anaïsa, to the love they once nurtured. The urge was insatiable, an invisible tether urging him onward, even as the laughter bubbled around him like a cruel tempest waiting to be calmed. Then everything changed in an instant. The evening wore on, and the board of directors began to form an impromptu gathering at the front of the hall. Julian's anxiety peaked when Rich took to the stage, commanding the audience with a charisma that contrasted painfully with his own internal chaos. The way Rich's confidence cascaded over the room made everything feel further away from Julian. He was a ghost on the periphery, invisible among the thrumming pulse of laughter and conversation. As the applause erupted and the spotlight fell upon Rich, Julian felt something dark swirling inside him, a cocktail of dread and outrage simmering beneath the surface. It was all too surreal, the splendor of this gala now tainted with a growing hysteria in his chest. He could barely follow Rich's words, which were coated with poise and bravado, their meaning drifting far from his grasp. Instead, he was assailed by the assault of memories. Their new home, candlelit dinners, stolen kisses, moments that felt sculpted with love, now crumbling like a brittle wind-blown leaf. Inside, he was battling a tempest that grew more monstrous with every laugh that slipped from Anisa's lips, every smirk shared with her superior. Just as he thought he might disappear altogether, hoping to blend into the ornate wallpaper, Ulrich, the outspoken board member, rose with a determination that sent a ripple through the audience. His voice broke through the applause, bold and accusing. "Let's talk about transparency, shall we? The board has come together to confront some troubling disclosures involving our esteemed leader." The air shifted. Julian felt it crackle under the pressure, igniting his internal alarm. He caught snippets of their conversation, phrases like financial misconduct and ethical breach that wormed their way into his ears like an invasive pest. The tension wrapped around his throat, drawing tight. Could this be the break he sought, the chance to shatter the illusion surrounding his life? Or would it deepen the chasm between him and Anaïsa? Without warning, the tone shifted when another voice echoed across the room, a calm yet weighty interjection that sent Julian's heart racing in both fear and hope. The narrator, unafraid and cool-headed, interjected with precision, revealing damning evidence of communications between Rich and Anaïsa. The words landed like hammer blows, each syllable a cruel scream that left the room reeling, the air heavy with disbelief. The eruption of voices silenced the hall, a symphony of chaos that reduced the sweet melodies of laughter to a discordant shrill. Julian found himself still as stone, stomach churning, heart racing faster than he thought possible. Rich's confident facade crumpled into shock, his eyes flaring wide, scanning the audience with desperation. Silence danced among the crowd, their collective breath drawn tight in disbelief, as all eyes turned toward Anaïsa. What lay on her face? A mask woven from betrayal and betrayal? Panic and desperation? It was a canvas for Julian's imagination, each stroke of emotion fracturing the very image of the woman he thought he loved. Was this the price he had to pay? Committed love crumbling fast like sand before a gale. The once unbreakable bond that they shared now dangled precariously at the edge of the precipice. Desperately, he gestured for Anaïsa to check her email, an act that meant more than any heartfelt apology could convey. She hesitated, as if suspended in air, a feather caught in a storm of indecision. Anything but the churning chaos of uncertainty, she flicked her eyes toward him with a mixture of confusion and fear. Did she even comprehend how inaccessible she had become? She was his wife, and yet at this moment, she felt like a stranger, operating in a world he could no longer touch. The seconds stretched, the weight of the world pressing down on Julian as he fought through a whirlwind of emotions, betrayal, hurt, conflicting instincts urging him toward love and vengeance. He wanted to scream, to demand she justify her actions amid the storm of accusations unfolding before them. And yet, staring at her trembling lips, he found no call for vengeance and revenge, simply numbness, the slow onset of understanding that perhaps there were layers to Anaïsa he had yet to uncover. "God, Anaïsa." The words slipped past his lips before he could catch them, a raw whisper tainted with confusion. "This can't be happening." She finally pulled her phone from her purse, and Julian could see the trembling in her hands. The clash of emotions played on her face, a warrior waging an internal battle. The silence surrounding them was deafening, a vacuum that threatened to suffocate the truth lurking beneath the surface. She read the messages on her screen, the text blurring into a primitive code laden with accusations, terminology bloated with the weight of future consequences. His heart slammed against his ribcage, tension formulated in the curve of his spine. The realization crystallized around him. She was trapped between two fires, the consequences of her actions threatening to engulf her in flames. "Julian," she finally breathed, her voice fraying at the edges. I can explain." The words were meant to bridge the gap between them, but they fell flat against the stark reality of their situation. "Explain what? The lies? The implausible denials you had to build just to get through the day?" His voice shook under the weight of unspoken hurt, every syllable snapping like a taut string. The rawness of it all left him exposed, vulnerable. It was one thing to be confronted amid swirling chaos, but it felt wholly unbearable to witness the betrayal unveiled with so many eyes watching, a harsh lens riveted spotlighting the fault lines beneath their union. The crowd behind them buzzed, tension thick enough to slice through, the muted murmurs becoming a ribcage cradling the heartache unfolding. Rich's shock morphed into something slightly sinister, a predator gleeful in its pursuit. What were you hoping for, Anaisa? Julian pressed on, voice rising. Was this your endgame? Your affair masked by financial impropriety and crooked leadership. The words coiled in his throat, blistering betrayals furiously unleashed. I didn't, she attempted, but Julian cut her off, feeling the walls coursing with weighty anticipation, as if the gathered mass held their breath, waiting for the next strike in this tragic unfolding. You didn't, or you didn't want me to know. His voice fell to a whisper, exhaustion threading through him, his chest heaving under the tumult of past and present colliding. He felt lost in the wreckage of their unraveling, angry tides swallowed by fierce waves of regret. Every question, every thought loomed larger, strangling the initial glimmers of hope. What could have been would now be accompanied by what would never be again. The pain felt wretched, tightening against the warmth they built, now rendered frigid. That familiarity they once shared, an unblemished tapestry, now lay exposed, its threads entwined with dark truths. Rich, reveling in the unfolding drama, called out, "You have all the proof you need, darling. Isn't it time to face the truth?" The words dripped with condescension, an invitation to revel in the gladiatorial spectacle. Julian felt himself shrinking against the walls inside him, confronted with both love and rage colliding in a cacophony of emotion. This wasn't about him anymore. It was about her and what led her to this moment. Was the spark of desire so easy to extinguish? Did ambition consume tender liaisons? Anaisa stood frozen, the embodiment of fear, regret curling around her. Julian had always believed love could weather storms. Now he questioned whether love alone could bind wounds torn irreversibly open. The cocktail of emotions led him down a path he wished he could avoid, yet it coursed through his veins, rendering everything in its wake both harsh and guilt-ridden. As Julian stared into her eyes, something within him cracked and splintered, a longing to reach out and drag her back, to hold on to the love he recognized and risk everything to mend what unraveled. But every instinct screamed not to collapse, not to fold into the depths of despair. Silence enveloped them again, pregnant with unspoken truths. The weight of realization hung palpably in the air, shattered yet determined. He owed it to their past, to the memories they had cultivated, and to the love that once felt immutable. Gathering his resolve, he rejected the tide that sought to drown him. Then let's face it. Together. It was an admission wrapped in vulnerability, a step forward together in an uncertain future, both willing and terrified to confront this new reality. And as Anaisa's gaze faltered, Julian felt the marbled altar beneath him shift, the first step into the unknown, toward the precipice of truth and the uncertain shadows that awaited them. Reality beckoned them forward, and the world narrowed into the space that existed only between them. The room held its breath as Anaisa pulled out her phone. Moments turned into eternity as she navigated through the digital incriminating letters she had exchanged with Rich, the messages building a case for betrayal so undeniable, the air around them thickened with pain and regret. Julian watched as her face twisted into realization, the weight of guilt pressing down hard on her shoulders. Her breath hitched, and the laughter that filled the room was now laced with whispers of shock and betrayal. The spectators' reactions filled the void Julian could no longer remain silent in. Months of doubt swirled violently in his mind. Now a tangible proof emerged, unforgiving and stark against the backdrop of their shared life. He could see the tremors of panic wiring their way through Anaisa, but rather than seek to comfort her, he reflected on the choices she had made. The man he once knew faded into the shadows, replaced by a stranger standing before him, paralyzed by the truth they both now faced. "Please, just let me explain," she stammered, her hands trembling as her eyes darted between the screen and Julian, searching for something: reassurance, forgiveness, understanding. But the truth hung heavy in the air, wrapping around them like an uninvited guest at their most intimate gathering. Yet there was no camaraderie left. All Julian felt was an all-consuming struggle against the tide of emotion. The messages flickered across her screen, the contents akin to daggers thrusting into his heart, each word a reminder of falsehoods that painted their days in shades of deceit. It was as if someone had pulled back a curtain, revealing the ugly truth behind the carefully curated facade they called a life. Their shared history felt battered, a fragile old album with cracked photographs, cherished moments overshadowed by unchecked ambition and fleeting desires. Explain? Explain what, Anaisa? The bitterness dripped from his voice, laced with jagged edges of confusion and denial. How you chose to entangle yourself in secret exchanges with my wife's boss. Do you even comprehend the gravity of what you've done? The room had become a crucible, forcing them to face the fire they had unwittingly ignited. The eyes of their colleagues bore down upon them with a mix of curiosity and horror, the grandiosity of the gala eclipsed by the tragedy unfolding. Laughter now felt sacrilegious, the buoyant atmosphere shattered into hushed tones and murmurs of disbelief. "I was confused, Julian. I thought I could manage it," she pleaded. Yet her words fell flat, echoing hollowly off the ornate walls that had witnessed the demise of their union, their intimacy dissipating like mist in sunlight. Desperation washed over her, but was suffocated beneath a reality she could no longer sidestep. Gripping the edge of the table, Julian braced himself, pulling deep from the well of emotions he had hidden far too long. The man on the stage had reveled in his power, parading around like a king, while he, Julian, stood as a court jester, uninvited to the dance of deception. "You didn't think I'd notice? That I'd simply overlook the whispers shared between you and Rich?" An incredulous laugh escaped him, tinged with hysteria. "Did you believe love could survive your betrayal without leaving scars? Did you think I wouldn't feel it when the warmth you used to reserve for me was so easily handed over?" Anisa's eyes glistened, and for a fleeting moment, it appeared as though deep regret surged through her, but then she faltered, doubt clouding her expression. The horror of her choices etched lines of fear onto her youthful face, but it was somewhere beyond the surface, beneath the tinny beats of the crowd. It was an agony that resonated deep within herself. Each message she read felt like an imprint of sin revealing her most hidden fears, and Julian felt an unfamiliar ache within him, torn between love and fury. You think like love can conquer all, but love screams louder in the midst of silence. The words escaped him, bitter yet revealing a fleeting glimpse of his heart, raw and open, still tethered to the essence of who Anaïsa once was. Suddenly, Julian found himself standing at crossroads, where anger met sadness, where hope bloomed like wildflowers in the crevices of despair. Here was the woman he had devoted himself to, intertwined in the fabric of his dreams and memories, now unraveled before him. "I trusted you." The heaviness of the words hung in the air, a titanic wave crashing over him, the riptide pulling him deeper. "I never meant to hurt you," she whispered, voice trembling as tears pooled in her eyes. "I was searching for something. I thought I could control it." There was a desperate energy to her, a flutter of vulnerability that wildly thrashed against the backdrop of their shattered marriage. But Julian drowned in the sharp edges of her actions, the truth of it striking like a whip against his skin. Each beat of his heart echoed not only the love they once shared, but an overwhelming loss, the present maliciously clashing with the past. "What about our plans? Our future?" he pressed, the rage in his heart oscillating with a profound sadness. "You shattered our promises. You betrayed our intentions. Do you remember the vows we took? Did they mean nothing to you?" Anaïsa stood frozen, caught within an internal tempest brewing just beneath the surface. Thoughts poured into her eyes, darkening them with ghosts of indecision. "I've made mistakes, truly. But can't we find a way back? Can't we?" No, the words slammed against the air, sharp and definitive, cutting her plea off like a knife. Every plea echoed back an eternity of uncertainty, risking repercussions that extended beyond the personal. "I want to believe there's room to salvage this, but right now, how can I trust you again? How can I leap forward into an abyss designed by betrayal?" As her silent fears flickered through her gaze, Julian felt a palpable shift around them, as if the world around was whispering their shared pain. It was a communion of broken dreams and fragile hopes laid bare before the inquisitive eyes tracking him, murmuring softly as if in reverence. Those curious glances felt like daggers probing deep wounds he had just recently opened, each whispered comment echoing the awfulness of it all, the swift, untamed reckoning crashing against the echoes of love both had once treasured. In the gravity of that moment, Julian caught glimpses of what the aftermath would be, a slow, grinding tumble toward inevitable decisions, the very fabric of their lives turning threadbare. There were hurtful, biting edges in the back of his throat, but even more pressing was the blurred reality they once painted so vividly together, the love, passion, and understanding now drowned in treachery. "Whatever we had before, it is irrevocably tainted, Anaïsa," he managed, words heavy with unshed tears. Each syllable carried the memories of their laughter, their shared dreams, now ghostly shadows trapped beneath layers of deception. Julian felt as if he were drifting further away, an anchor lost to the depths, every second dragging him into those murky waters. Distantly, the applause of the crowd dimmed, a tide receding, leaving only the echoes of responsibility left to carry. Rich's taunts had vanished amid the darkness creeping in, but the sound of shattered promises reverberated with sharp clarity in the raw silence. As Anisa's gaze dropped, Julian realized they were at the edge of something monumental. They could choose to face this reckoning together, examining the shards of their past, or walk away entirely fractured. The shadows between them stretched to infinity, reaching toward painful truths yet to be unveiled. And with the weight of those choices looming overhead, Julian stepped closer to the precipice of the unknown, determined to ignite the spark of self-discovery for both of them, to confront this chaos head-on, rooted in a fierce desire for clarity and truth. The specter of betrayal hung heavy, but he would uncover the lesson buried within it, both for Anaïsa and for himself, as they dared to step into the fragile, uncharted territory of forgiveness and vulnerability. Within minutes, chaos erupted, leaving the event shaken to its core. Rich's insults burned brightly. He had not only humiliated Julian, but also unwittingly invited ruin upon himself. The board adjourned in a frenzy, Ulrich grappling against the wave of consequences. Julian stood transfixed, the air thick with disbelief, the dull roar of murmurs swarming around him like hornets. It was as if the gala had morphed into a battleground, where his heart, torn as it was, bore the fiercest scars. Anisa's face was a portrait of shattered innocence. The coiled strands of her confidence unraveled into threads of despair. Guilt exchanged glances with fury in her eyes, and Julian could almost feel the invisible chasm that opened between them, its edges crumbling under the weight of their shared history. Once, they had danced in sync to an unspoken melody, but now he found himself lost in the discordant notes of betrayal and sorrow. Julian, Anisa's voice fought against the rising tide of scrutiny. The pleading in her tone drew a stark contrast to the chaos around them, tiny flickers of intimacy amidst the crowd's judgment. Yet he couldn't respond, couldn't bear to delve into a well of emotions he had only just pried himself from. The moments in the aftermath felt surreal. Rich staggered back, the venomous glances of the board turning into daggers rather than the applause of admiration he thrived on. He had built his castle on lies, reveling in the art of manipulation, but now those walls crashed down, echoes of arrogance ricocheting around the room. Julian glanced at him, a smirk cracking his mask of pain. Rich's downfall was a bitter victory, sweetened only by the justice that glimmered in the air. "Anaïsa, we need to go," Julian finally said, his voice firm yet strained. He reached for her wrist, guiding her away from the wreckage of their lives. She felt impossibly fragile beneath his fingers, a mist dissipating in the face of a storm. The both of them were now outsiders in a narrative that had once welcomed them warmly, a family of colleagues turned judges. The floor where they had danced was transformed into a landmine of emotions, and with every step, newfound clarity began to swim to the surface through the chaos. Her breath hitched, and the sound tremored through him like an earthquake. As they descended the staircase leading to the exit, he could feel the weight of eyes, the silent testimony of curiosity and judgment clinging to their backs. Every pair of eyes bore a different story, yet they all told the same tale of betrayal. Each observer etched memories of the night into permanence, leaving Julian and Anaïsa to navigate the remnants of a fractured reality. Outside, the neon lights glistened against the night's darkness, ridged shadows carving out spaces where vulnerability could breathe, where they could step away from the bleeding aspect of their history, if only for a moment. Yet the breathless silence between them spewed forth inadequacies, memories swirling in a tempest of unspoken words. The street was a mirror of disarray, barely filled with life. It felt more like a reflection of the turmoil they carried in their hearts. "Anaïsa, why?" His voice was like a whisper lost in the wind, each word carrying the weight of the questions they had yet to confront. Tension thrummed in the air between them, electric and raw, like a live wire, dangerous yet unyielding. "Why would you choose him? Rich? What were you searching for that you couldn't find with me?" Her eyes flared with anguish, and for a moment he caught a glimpse of the Anaïsa he used to know, a woman of dreams and laughter who embraced life with both hands. I thought I could control it," she murmured, her voice a fragile whisper. "Work was demanding. He made me feel seen in ways I hadn't experienced in a while." Julian shook his head slowly, disappointment surging within him like a tidal wave. "By lying? By abandoning everything we built together." Each syllable cracked under the weight of incredulity, and he could barely recognize the depth of the hurt that poured into his veins. "I never meant to hurt you, Julian," she replied, her voice now thick with emotion. "You have to believe me. I got caught in a web of ambition." "Ambition?" he scoffed, disbelief smoldering within him. "Is that what you call this betrayal? You knew the stakes. You knew how far that ambition could lead you." It was hard to keep the tremor from his voice, as his mind replayed all the moments of trust shattered against the walls of deceit. It felt as though his heart had turned to stone, heavy in his chest yet tender to the touch. As they stood beneath the harsh fluorescence of the street lamps, Anisa's vulnerability and remorse weighed upon Julian like a shroud. "I feel like I've lost everything, Julian," she cried, tears spilling over like a dam now breached. "I lost my job, my integrity, and I stand here losing you. It destroys me to think that I could hurt the one person I love." Anger warred with sympathy in the pit of his stomach. He saw the desperate woman before him, and yet steeped in regret, realization dawned upon him that she had made a choice, one that not only cost her, but him as well. And though she stood there, unraveling like thread pulled too tightly, he couldn't allow himself to tumble into the well with her, not when the situation was drenched in betrayal. "Anissa, what was left of our vows?" Julian reflected, his voice bitter yet hollow, unable to familiarize himself with the truth of their desolation. "We promised to choose each other, to confront our storms together. And you chose him. Do you even comprehend what that feels like?" Overhead, the moon hung low, a witness to their heartache, glowing brightly against an inky backdrop that mirrored the depth of his own despair. He scanned her face, watching as she twisted a gold ring on her finger, a token of their union now marred by forgery. Trust had been a fragile knot, now frayed beyond repair, and he wondered whether there was ever a way back from the depths they had plummeted into. The distance between them felt insurmountable, the irrevocable choices they had both made leaving a stinging wound on their hearts. As the city thrummed around them, a distant hum of life continuing unceremoniously, Julian sensed reality crashing down, every thought leaving shadows that danced ominously on the edges of his mind. He took a step back, involuntary yet instinctive, a defense against the tidal wave of emotion that threatened to sweep him away. "You have to understand, I can't be the one to pick up the pieces. Not now. Not when the shards cut so deep." With a final glance back at her, eyes shimmering with unshed tears, a mixture of longing and remorse, he turned, resolute. The path ahead was uncertain, clouded with the debris of their choices, but he refused to drown amidst of it. Each step away felt heavier than the last, but he recognized that he was the architect of his own healing, with the fierce resolve to walk out from the rubble of betrayal toward a future still waiting to be forged. Julian stepped into the night, determined to rediscover the essence of who he was, setting ablaze a fire of strength that flickered deep within. Courage always struggled through peril, and he'd find it amid the ruins she had left behind. The courthouse stood before him like a final frontier, a monument of severed ties and broken dreams. Desperation coursed through Julian's veins as he faced the stark walls, their somber tones mirroring the gray looming worry over his heart. He could still taste the remnants of shame and anger from the gala that felt like a chaotic lifetime ago. Anisa's pleas for forgiveness echoed in his mind, each word resonating as a heart-wrenching reminder of what had been lost. The enormity of everything they once shared pressed hard against his chest, constricting and suffocating. Here stood the woman he once adored, broken but unrepentant, all in the wake of screams of betrayal that shadowed them both. "Anissa, please." Her voice rang through the sterile court, but as she spoke, he could hardly recognize the vibrant laughter that used to fill their shared space. She was desperate now, a plea wrapped in a cascade of words that lost clarity with each syllable. "I never wanted this. I'll do anything to make it right." Even as she articulated remorse, Julian remained steadfast, infused with the bitter taste of distrust that tainted every fond recollection. Memories of joy seemed to fade like the waning light of day. Every kindness she once extended felt distant, far removed from the woman before him. He thought back to their anniversary, when they had danced in their living room, laughter mingling with romance, years spent creating a life entwined in hopes and dreams. Memories that now flickered dimly, like fading lights in the evening sky, eclipsed by the jagged shards of her betrayal. The surreal atmosphere in that courtroom gnawed at him. With every word spoken, he felt the years slip through his fingers, memories tainted by betrayal's paintbrush. The mundane gave way to the catastrophic. They stood amid piles of broken glass that were once the semblance of their marriage, and every confrontation forced him to reconsider the trust that once came so easily. He looked into Anisa's eyes, searching for remnants of the woman he had loved amidst the ruins of their neglected vows, yet saw only an enemy masked in familiar lines of pain and regret. How could they return to innocence when both were drenched in guilt? "We were a family, Anissa," he said, voice cracking, the tension between them palpable, vibrating with unresolved energy. "This, whatever this is, it's not forging anything. It's a fracture, a wound that cuts so deep. The silence that followed swallowed them whole. Anaïsa pressed her lips together, and the small movement sparked a sense of unease within him. The tears she held back glistened in her eyes like unshed raindrops waiting for a storm. It struck him then. She, too, was navigating an abyss, but it was one of her own making. Moments turned into agonizing eternity as he remembered the feel of her fingers tracing his jawline, the way she had whispered promises beneath the quilt of their intimacy. Those layers of tenderness had melted into the fabric that bound them. Now the heartbreak hung heavy in the air, suffocating all that had once been vibrant and alive. The pain reshaped him, forcing clarity through the fog of his despair. "I thought we were strong," she whispered, anguish carved deep in her voice. "I thought ambition would elevate me, elevate us. I didn't realize it would destroy everything." "You made a choice, Anaïsa," Julian countered, the steel in his voice slicing through her feeble defenses. His attention might have felt like validation, a cigarette to soothe the craving, but that validation was built on a lie. "You chose to betray me." Each word left his mouth like lead, heavy with unyielding truth. His throat felt raw. His heart threatened to crack under the burden of fractured dreams. Were they even dreams at all, or merely illusions she had painted over the canvas of their lives? As if struck, Anaïsa recoiled slightly, her expression morphing from despair to defensive anger. "I was lonely. You were always working." His heart raced, ascending into the realms of fury he had fought to suppress. "Working? I was fighting for us, fighting to make a life for us. And you chose him." The passion in his voice vibrated through the hollow halls, a reminder that honesty must also bear witness when love falters. The silence again thickened the air, a deep chasm yawning further between them. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but the words never formed. Instead, tears slipped free, tracing pathways down her cheeks. Each drop told a story, one of fractured triumphs, of a fleeting love that had spun out of control into nightmares. Gone was the softness he adored, replaced by a hardened sadness that weighed heavily on them both. "I didn't mean for it to go this far," she said, him moving slightly backward as if her vulnerability threatened to ensnare his heart once more, to bridge the gap they had just begun to forge with honesty and rawness. "I was lost in everything and momentarily blinded to what was real. I thought I could manage it, easily tidy the words up afterward." The anguish within him twisted with empathy. Still, he felt the nails of self-preservation clutching tightly at his heart. "But you didn't," he replied softly, his eyes catching the glimmer of betrayal upon her features. "It's not just about forgiveness anymore. It's about trust. Trust turned to dust with every secret message you exchanged, every fleeting moment you took for yourself while leaving me in the dark." The revelation was bitter. In his mind, he could see the shambles of their once unassailable foundation. He could see her navigating a world of pretense, weaving through obstacles only to find herself ensnared. And yet, while empathy flirted with his tired heart, anger remained, roiling like a storm within his chest. "Anaïsa, what was left of our vows?" he implored, his voice dropped to a whisper, barely audible over the drumming rain falling on the courthouse steps. "How could we ever rebuild from this?" She bowed her head, and in that moment, he saw not just his wife but a reflection of the pain that threaded through them both. The rain outside drummed against the roof, a cleansing rhythm to match their own unsteady breaths. Each drop dripped heavily from the awning, pounding against the glass windows, drowning out the world for just a heartbeat longer. "So this is it, then?" Julian's last question cut through the illusion, just as the finality of their love's demise hit harder than anything else could. It felt like surrender. It felt like freedom wrapped up in the delicate fabric of loss. He turned to leave, unsure but resolute. It was a detachment that felt both liberating and suffocating, his heart racing ahead, eager to escape the storm. Each step out of the courthouse felt monumental, the weight of expectations and shared memories clamoring for attention as he walked nearly in a daze. Anice's soft voice called after him, a fragile plea carried on the wind. "Julian, I'm so sorry." But in that moment, he was no longer bound to the past. "I can't stay, Anaïsa," he replied, the words spilling forth from a place deep inside him. With every step away, the distance between them expanded, a gap overshadowed by possibility, yet fraught with painful memories. And as he stepped into the rain, he breathed in the clarity of the air, mixing into the symphony of droplets, a melancholy reminder that healing demanded solitude, and that he was finally beginning to reclaim his truth amidst the ruins she had left behind. Emerging from the courthouse, Julian inhaled the crisp air as freedom seeped into his bones. He had reclaimed not just his autonomy, but his self-worth. The finality of the divorce offered a cathartic release, allowing him to separate the dream from the nightmare that had consumed him for too long. With the weight of 100 burdens dropped behind him, he navigated the city streets, each step elevating his spirits, as if the very ground beneath his feet had transformed into a path leading towards renewal. He felt light, lighter than he had in years, and ready to embrace the solace of solitude that beckoned him like an old friend. As he walked, the familiar hum of the city enveloped him. The hum of bustling traffic blended with laughter emanating from nearby cafes and restaurants. The scents of roasted coffee and freshly baked bread drifted through the air, tantalizing his senses. Coffee shops, once just a backdrop to hurried conversations with colleagues or last-minute meetings, morphed into beacons of shared joy. Julian began to see them as sanctuaries away from the conflicting emotions that had once drowned him. He imagined cozy corners where strangers gathered, their faces glowing with delight over steaming mugs, an affirmation that life would continue to pulse vibrantly even in the aftermath of heartache. With that thought, Julian decided to retreat into one of those welcoming establishments, a small coffee shop nestled away from the crowds, adorned with mismatched furniture and spirited art on the walls. The warm atmosphere wrapped around him like a comforting blanket, urging him to rest for a moment. Sliding into a cozy nook, he observed the world around him, allowing the noise to wash over him without seeking to drown it out. There were girls giggling over oversized mugs, friends huddled over laptops, and couples intertwined in the glow of their own little universe. He ordered an espresso, the bitter aroma igniting memories of late nights spent discussing dreams, of plans sculpted under the soft glow of streetlights during midnight drives, and the laughter that once echoed abundantly in his life. As he waited, he caught his reflection in the glass, a face softened by time, marked with pain yet freshly washed with the therapeutic waves of self-discovery. Instead of anguish, he saw determination. Instead of hopelessness, there was resolve. Every heartache and betrayal now etched not just scars, but lessons learned and wisdom gained. A young woman sat at a nearby table, buried in a book, her brow furrowed in concentration. She occasionally glanced up, her gaze lingering as if Julian was an intriguing puzzle daring to be solved. With every stolen look, an unexpected spark thrummed in the air. Perhaps it was a fleeting reminder of the connection that could still exist outside the confines of his past. The idea filled him with both excitement and apprehension. For the first time, it seemed possible that new relationships awaited him just beyond the horizon of grief. After finishing his drink, Julian decided to take a stroll through the nearby park, a favorite haunt of his from years gone by. The sun had begun to dip behind a veil of clouds, casting a golden light that filtered through the budding leaves and danced along the walking paths. Laughter erupted from children playing nearby, their joy infectiously vibrant. Each step on the rugged terrain became an exploration, a rediscovery of whom he was without the ghost of his marriage looming overhead. Reflecting on this journey, he began to reach for the segments of his life that had long been neglected, passions buried beneath childish ambitions and fleeting hobbies extinguished by disillusionment. The flowers blooming wildly along the park's edge reminded him of the dreams he had set aside. Julian felt a calling to read books that had challenged him in the past, to dive into stories and worlds he had always wanted to explore. One book in particular, an old classic he had never quite finished, flickered in his memory. It echoed sentiments of love, loss, and redemption that mirrored his current odyssey. He could almost feel the words cascading through him, washing away the remnants of pain like a cleansing waterfall. The thought sparked in him an idea, to reclaim his days not as a victim, but as a survivor. He envisioned evenings spent in cozy nooks, books in hand, and the gentle escape from the thrall of the everyday. As he walked, he felt liberated. Each step was symbolic, proclaiming his renewed commitment to live authentically. He glanced around, and for the first time in what felt like ages, he found elegance in the ordinary. A couple sharing ice cream, an elderly man feeding pigeons, laughter echoing from the park benches. The pieces of daily life assembled into a vivid mosaic, and Julian felt each fragment resonate within him, beckoning him to embrace this new chapter. Julian opened himself up to connections, and soon began to engage with people, each conversation layered with authenticity and simplicity. He met people whose laughter felt honest, those whose eyes sparkled without the weight of hidden agendas. There was Carol, the spirited artist he encountered while browsing through a gallery, her passion igniting fresher ideas in him. There was Marcus, with his ardent discussions on philosophy, whose insights challenged Julian, pushing him toward greater clarity about his own existence. Each new encounter felt rich and vibrant, spiraling him toward a life reimagined. And each day began unfurling a new layer of healing. With the restorative rhythm of morning routines and the stillness of evening reflections, he allowed time to transform him gently. It wasn't always easy. There were nights when shadows of doubt slipped back into his consciousness, whispering remnants of betrayal and heartache in quiet tones. Yet with each passing day, he recognized those shadows for what they were, remnants of a past that no longer had the power to define him. As Julian continued his walk through the park, watching the sun set and transition into a symphony of colors painting the sky, he paused to breathe in that transition. Every hue, every blend reminded him of his own evolution. He no longer feared loneliness. Instead, he began to find solace in it. Solitude transformed from a prison to a sanctuary, a canvas upon which he could paint the palette of his life with newfound vibrancy. He stepped forward as a man renewed, not entirely untouched by scars, but aware now of their beauty as testament to resilience and growth. With the city stretching out before him, warm and inviting, he felt eager to uncover the opportunities ahead. The wayward winds of the past still brushed up against him like ghosts, but Julian was determined to dance lightly in their company. He could reminisce but no longer be captivated by their depths. That evening, as twilight settled, he returned home, where shadows had danced along the walls. He turned on the lights, the glow washing over him like a comforting embrace, a stark contrast to the darkness that had previously overwhelmed. Tonight marked the first step to reclaiming his space, reimagining his life, and embracing possibilities as he stood at the threshold of something new, something profound. Months had passed since that fateful day in the courthouse, and now, as I stood on the balcony of my new apartment, the sunrise painted the horizon in vibrant hues of orange and pink, illuminating both the sky and my heart. The beauty of it felt almost surreal. It was as if I had been given a second chance at life, and the world was welcoming me back with open arms. I took a deep breath, inhaling the fresh morning air that swept across the city, and with it, I felt the remnants of the heartache that had once shattered my spirit begin to recede. It was no longer an all-consuming pain, but rather a collection of scars that reminded me of my journey. In the solitude of my newfound space, I learned to embrace the echoes of my past, allowing remorse to evolve into forgiveness. It wasn't directed at Anaïsa. Rather, it was aimed at myself. I kept myself trapped in a loveless prison for too long, chained by the weight of regret, feeling unworthy of love and happiness. Now, I finally took steps toward liberating myself from that emotional shackle. Each sunrise seemed to affirm this transition, reminding me that new beginnings could blossom from even the darkest nights. The memory of that corporate gala, where betrayal had reared its ugly head and adorned our lives with a pall of shame, began to fade. Its lessons and truths, sharp and undeniable, remained vivid within me, yet I no longer felt the urge to dwell on those painful moments. Instead, I had found strength in constructing a narrative that belonged solely to me. I was reclaiming my life, emerging more robust and more complex than I had known to be possible. I looked out over the sprawling city, and it felt like a patchwork of opportunities waiting to be embraced. Each building, each park, each bustling street began to illuminate with potential. My heart swelled with anticipation for what lay ahead. Determined to weave a community filled with connection and authentic relationships, I sought to engage with the world around me. The idea of building new relationships felt invigorating. I envisioned uplifting interactions, conversations woven with vulnerability and sincerity. I wanted to open up not just my home but my heart as well, to allow life's beauty and humanity back in after a long season of isolation. With these thoughts swirling through my mind, a resolute fire ignited within me, compelling me to share my story. My experience of love lost and the tumult of heartbreak had carved paths through my soul, and I understood the power of storytelling. Others traversing similar dark landscapes might find solace in my words, a flicker of hope ignited by the understanding that they, too, could emerge on the other side of despair. Filled with newfound purpose, I turned away from the balcony, the view of a bright new day anchoring me in the moment. There was much to be done. I gathered my journals, the pages filled with reflections of sorrow, growth, and lessons learned. I sought a balance between the brave man I had become and the vulnerable boy who had been hurt. I felt it appropriate to start small, sharing my experiences through blogs and social media walls, shedding the heavy burden of silence. As sunlight poured through the apartment windows, I began to type, letting my fingers dance over the keyboard. The words flowed out of me, referencing the raw truth of betrayal, but also extending grace to myself for not being the man I had once hoped to be. I crafted sentences that unraveled the complexities of love and loss, infused with humor and humility. I reflected on the resilience that had carried me through, resonating with the belief that I could inspire someone else to reclaim their narrative as I had done. Each keystroke felt cathartic, my heart lightening with the weight of my truth embraced and expressed. Casting aside the desperation for validation that had clung tightly to me before, I focused instead on authenticity, on striking a chord that might resonate within another soul buried deep under the ruins of betrayal. Not long after, I decided to dive deeper into my untapped passions, embracing the creative avenues of my life that had long since faded. The realm of books called to me, lessons within their pages whispering promises of connection and understanding. I dusted off titles that had collected layers of neglect, reigniting a love for literature I had set aside during the tumultuous years of my marriage. Each book became a stepping stone towards self-discovery, narratives weaving through my own shadows, illuminating paths toward healing. I recalled a particular novel from my youth, a classic I had never quite completed. It told a story of love's complex tapestry, entwining threads of both joy and suffering. That book flickered in my memory, embodying the sentiments I craved to explore more deeply. I made it my mission to finish that book, to wrap my mind around the transformational journey within its pages, which echoed my own. As I ventured on this path of self-exploration, I found beauty in the mundane. Children playing freely in the park, couples enjoying their time together, the simple act of laughter ringing through the air like music. Each moment began to captivate me, reinvigorating my sense of wonder. Taking the time to engage with life around me felt like reclaiming pieces of myself that I had neglected for far too long. I embraced a morning routine, coffee brewed in my small kitchen, the fragrance stimulating my senses, grounding me for the day ahead. Inspired, I began to reach out to others, striving for connection that felt enriched and genuine. I struck up conversations with people I encountered, tapping into their stories while exchanging snippets of my own. I learned of Carol, the spirited artist at a gallery who spoke passionately about her craft, igniting sparks of creativity within me. And there was Marcus, who challenged my perspectives on life with profound discussions and shared laughter that seemed to breathe life into our interactions. As each new connection flourished, I began to gather a mosaic of relationships that felt fulfilling and reciprocal, no longer the one-dimensional experiences from my past. I cherished these conversations, reveling in the simplicity of sharing stories over coffee, walking through bustling streets, and soaking in the laughter of new friendships. Late one evening, as I reflected on my day, I felt forged anew, a man not untouched by the dark embrace of betrayal, but one who had allowed the light of resilience to guide him forward. The memories of my old life still brushed against my consciousness like fleeting shadows, but this time, they were just shadows. They did not dictate my narrative. When I stood on that balcony the next morning, the sun spilling warmth across my face, I felt invigorated. The world spread out before me like an uncharted map, the horizon brimming with possibility. I was ready to embrace whatever challenges lay ahead, knowing that while betrayal had altered my path, it had not defined it. I smiled at the prospect of what could be, a future steeped in authenticity, rich with relationships and vibrant with hope. I was no longer a lost man searching for solace. I was a survivor, steady and true, eager to live a life defined by my own terms.